Throughout history, man has devised a myriad of ways to punish wrongdoers or to extract information from them. Some are physical and involve inflicting horrific pain. Others use psychological methods to break the victim's mind. Whichever branch used, trust me, you don't want to be on the receiving end of any of them. But we have ways of making you talk. Today, Descent into Darkness explores the worst torture methods of history. Thumbscrews. Beginning with a little amuse-bouche before we get into the more extreme methods, the thumbscrews are a simple device that secures the digits in place, and a turnscrew slowly applies pressure at the behest of the torturer. One of the many products of the Dark and Medieval Ages, the thumbscrews are very much entry-level in the grand scheme of the classical torture chamber. Of course, eventually, the pressure imparted by the device was easily capable of breaking the bones. Strangely and hilariously, the device also gained the cutesy-sounding nickname of Pillywinks. It's not really relevant, but there was no way that I was going to leave that out. The thumbscrews continued to be used right up to the middle 1700s, being used to torture slaves. A variation of this method is the use of pliers or pinchers to remove the fingernails or toenails as applicable, and that is most definitely the point where I would literally confess to anything. Hell, I would tell you it was me that capped Jimmy Hoffa. Anything to help me just nope on out of there. The rack. A must-have for any aspiring medieval tyrant, the rack is perhaps the most iconic torture apparatus of all. The rack involves a flat bed with a windlass at each end. The victim could have their wrists and ankles tied individually to a rope attached to the winding gear. The interrogation would begin, and every time they refused to answer, the wheels would slowly turn, increasing the strain on the limbs. The beauty of this punishment is that the pain it inflicts can be very carefully controlled entirely at the captor's discretion. Eventually, of course, if the victim does not give up, he will most certainly have his major joints dislocated. But this could take as long or as short as the interrogator wishes. Guy Fawkes, the only person to have entered Parliament with honest intentions, was almost certainly subjected to this method, along with many others. By the end of his interrogation, he was a broken man in every sense of the word, as evidenced by his signatures both before and after. The breaking wheel. Another equally gruesome punishment, the breaking wheel could be used for either punishment or execution. It consisted of a literal wagon wheel that was affixed to the wall, with fastening points for ropes and manacles. Manacles! Oh! My idea of heaven is to be allowed to be put in manacles just for a few hours. You must think the sun shines out of your arse, sonny. The victim is secured by their limbs to the wheel, and their captor will then set about breaking the bones of their limbs one by one, usually with a blunt object, such as a large hammer. This could either be done in private or in public to give the proles something to watch, long before the invention of Love Island. I know which I'd rather watch. Another version of the breaking wheel involves having the victim strapped to the floor, and then lifting the wheel up and dropping it down on the limbs to break them. If being used to execute, the final coup de grace could be given by dropping the wheel directly onto the neck, collapsing the larynx, and rendering breathing virtually impossible, suffocating the guy to death. Either way, you're gonna have a bad time. Suspension. A favourite method of the Spanish Inquisition, this involves using the body's own weight to cause pain. The most common way is to tie the wrists directly behind the back and then to haul the victim off the ground by the wrists. As I'm sure you can imagine, this does not tickle. This method is called strappado, which definitely sounds like a kinky sex act. The effect can be greatly amplified by securing weights to the person's feet, increasing the pressure on the limbs. Crucifixion is the logical extension of the idea of suspension. The weight of the victim's body being so poorly supported eventually will cause suffocation. Another form of suspension torture is known as the sawhorse. Sometimes called the chevalet or Spanish donkey, the victim has their hands tied behind their back and their ankles tied together underneath the bar of a sawhorse. They are then left there for as long as their torturer sees fit. Not being able to shift their weight off of their groin area for very long, this quickly becomes an excruciating feeling, no doubt also cutting off the blood supply to the genitals, which those gentlemen amongst you who have had the misfortune of riding a bicycle with an incorrectly adjusted saddle will know what I'm talking about. Basically, your John Thomas goes numb, and it is a weird feeling. Despite being a very archaic form of torture, likely to be found in the darkest and dankest of medieval torture chambers, the sawhorse was used regularly as a punishment for captured, unruly Confederate soldiers during the US Civil War. Many of those subjected to multiple instances of this punishment were crippled for life. Milton Ryan of G Company 8th Mississippi Regiment reported, "There were some of our poor boys, for little infraction of the prison rules, riding what they called Morgan's mule every day. This was a mule that did the worst standing stock still. He was built after the pattern of those used by carpenters. He was about 15 feet high. The legs were nailed to the scantling so that one of the sharp edges was turned up, which made it very painful and uncomfortable to the poor fellow, especially when he had to be ridden bareback, sometimes with heavy weights fastened to his feet, sometimes with a large beef bone in each hand. This performance was carried on under the eyes of a guard with a loaded gun, and was kept up for several days, each ride lasting 2 hours each day, unless the fellow fainted and fell off from pain and exhaustion. Very few were able to walk after this hellish Yankee torture, but had to be supported to their barracks." I hope you all liked my southern drawl there. Marks out of 10? Bamboo torture. Being of an apocryphal torture method originating from Asia, this involved the victim being placed over a shoot of a particularly quick-growing species of bamboo. Some types of bamboo have the ability to grow as fast as 4 centimeters, a little over 1.5 inches an hour. As far as plant growth goes, that's practically ludicrous speed. The resultant shoot grows quick and strongly enough that it can easily push its way through the soft tissues of the body. The victim not being able to move or relieve the pain of this ordeal, coupled with being left for a few days for the bamboo to take hold, would soon have them asking for their jailers ready for a confession. But of course, their captors could simply not bother to release them, leaving the victims in place, turning the torture into a painfully slow execution. There are anecdotes dating from the early to middle 1800s from Malaya, Siam, and Ceylon of people being subjected to very similar methods to this, although they appear to have been using a type of mangrove or fast-growing palm. There are reports from the Second World War that the Japanese had used this torture method on its many POWs. I can quite readily believe that this is something that they would actually do. Did you see my video on Unit 731? Link below. Burning and branding. Ever wondered where the phrase, "to hold one's feet to the fire," comes from? Yeah, it was a very real thing. The idea of using extreme heat to extract info or torture someone is more than likely as old as fire itself. Let's face it, nearly every new invention will have someone in the background wondering one of 2 questions. Can I use this to kill or hurt someone, or can I fuck it? Those of you who have already watched the executions video that I did will remember the story of the Brazen Bull. For those of you that haven't, open up a new tab and get it watched. Come on, catch up. Link in the description. The thought of locking some poor git inside a gigantic statue and lighting a fire underneath it is quite frankly terrifying. By extension, literally having your feet forcibly held close to a raging fire until you give up what you are hiding, it's gonna be a no from me, dog. Thankfully, it's only a figure of speech these days, but the origins of our current Western justice system are grounded in this method. If one wished to prove one's innocence back in the Dark Ages, but you didn't have any witnesses or hard evidence, one way of doing so would be to hold a glowing hot iron bar. Your obviously horrific wounds would be bound and then checked after a few days. If your wounds had begun to heal, it was a sign of God's favour. However, if your wounds began festering, this was a sign of your guilt. Now, I shouldn't need to tell you that the likelihood of you picking up some kind of secondary illness such as gangrene, etc., were far more likely in the days where having a bath or even daily washing were not exactly common. So unless you were incredibly lucky, your chances of being found guilty due to this perceived lack of divine intervention would seal your fate. This method of justice was referred to as trial by ordeal. One could of course request the alternate of trial by combat, which, if those are my only two options, you best give me a sword. The Iron Maiden. Now, I was really torn about whether to include this one or not, as its use and even existence is heavily disputed, but in the finish, I knew that I just would not hear the end of it in the comments if I left it out, so here we go. The Iron Maiden, as well as being a brilliant band, is a torture device that seals a person inside a highly cramped space within. Classically, it is depicted with spikes covering the inside to restrict movement even further. They would stop the victim from slumping against the internal walls once their legs got tired. Now, despite the many depictions of them in art, literature, and film, there is virtually zero evidence that the Iron Maiden was ever a real thing. And this does not stop the vast majority of museums dedicated to this sort of thing having their own model of one in their collection. One of the oldest, quote-unquote, replicas, first being displayed in Nuremberg as far back as 1802. It appears to be just one of those things that has been repeated so often that the majority will swear blind that it's true, in kind of a Mandela effect. The only source that can be cited to prove its use is a piece telling of the execution of a man convicted for coin forgery on the 14th of August 1515. However, there is much debate amongst historians as to whether this account was entirely fictional. A variation of the Iron Maiden that absolutely did exist, though, was the oubliette, a word derived from the Middle French meaning to forget. Every castle torture chamber worth their salt would have had one. It was a fixed, highly cramped space set in the wall, usually with a narrow opening to get someone in and out. The space was only big enough to force the incumbent to either be constantly standing or in a crouched position, which are both known stress positions, which we shall look at next. One more modern use of an oubliette was at the Auschwitz concentration camp inside the infamous Block 11, which was used as the main punishment block in the first camp. Block 11 had standing cells of 1 yard square, into which they would cram up to 4 prisoners at any one time. Most of them would be kept in there for many hours or even days, without even a break to go to the toilet, being forced to stand in their own excrement in almost total darkness, with only a small 2 by 2 inch opening for fresh air for the duration of their punishment. Other camps were also known to have used standing cells built for punishment of low-level rule-breaking, most notably at Dachau. But it should also be mentioned that the Soviets made great use of this same style of cell in their infamous gulags, which will no doubt be getting their own video in future. Stress positions. Stress positions are a wide range of techniques that are designed to tire the body out by maintaining the same position for an extended period of time. Some of these can involve holding a heavy weight out at arm's length, squatting on the balls of one's feet, assuming a seated position with your back against the wall and your arms outstretched, or to be forced to kneel for hours at a time, amongst many others. The main purpose of stress positions is to cause extreme discomfort and to break the psychological will of the victim to resist. It causes lethargy, muscle and joint pain and fatigue. Failure to maintain the desired position for as long as the interrogator desires can result in a beating or further punitive punishments. Stress positions are still regularly used as a punishment in many militaries around the world for breaking the rules, But let's not forget, the purpose of military training is to break you down as a person and then rebuild you as a soldier, which is a totally different mindset from that of a civilian, and is an essential part of a cohesive and effective fighting force. Starvation. Starvation is a very simple method of withdrawing food and water and inducing a state of malnutrition. It is both a physical and a psychological torture. The signs of starvation include irritable mood, extreme fatigue, quickened heart rate and shallow breathing, a sunken face, pale, sallow skin, severely weakened immune system, and slow healing. The full effects of starvation can take many days or even weeks to take hold. The pathology of starvation occurs in 3 distinct separate phases. These are: Phase 1. When meals are skipped, the body begins to maintain blood sugar levels by degrading glycogen in the liver and breaking down stored fat and protein. The liver can provide glucose for the first few hours. After that, the body begins to break down fat and protein. The body uses fatty acids as an energy source for muscles, but lowers the amount of glucose sent to the brain. Another chemical that comes from fatty acids is glycerol. It can be used as glucose for energy, but eventually runs out. Phase 2 can last for weeks at a time. In this phase, the body mainly uses stored fat for energy. The breakdown occurs in the liver and turns fat into ketones. After fasting for 1 week, the brain will use these ketones and any available glucose. Using ketones lowers the need for glucose, and the body slows the breakdown of proteins. And then Phase 3. By this point, the fat stores are gone, and the body begins to turn to stored protein for energy. This means it needs to break down muscle tissues, which are full of protein. The muscles break down very quickly. Protein is essential for cells to work correctly, and when it runs out, the cells can no longer function. Death from starvation usually occurs due to an opportunistic infection that the body simply does not have the energy to fight off. The lack of water accelerates this process much quicker, but the body can survive longer on just water, as magician David Blaine proved during one of his ridiculous stunts where he suspended himself above London in a glass box for 44 days with only water in 2003, in a move that could only really muster the very British reaction of, "Why though?" A variation of this torture is to not actually withdraw food from the victim, but to administer it in a very different way, by pureeing it and administering it as an enema, in a method termed rectal infusion. Lovely. This is obviously exceedingly humiliating for the victim, having a tube shoved up your arse and a jug of liquid being poured in, and then having to keep it in. What is worse, this method has been used fairly recently with prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, as cited in a report that gained notoriety when it was highlighted by the HBO program Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, who inexplicably and somewhat hilariously paid the actress Dame Helen Mirren to narrate the report. I'll link that piece in the description. Sensory overload. This method is a type of psychological torture that relies on blasting people with loud, aggressive music, usually rock, heavy metal, or similar, and can be accompanied by extremely bright light or strobes shone directly at the face. This will prevent the victim from sleeping and will do damage to the ears and eyes over a prolonged period. This method was one of the more creative ones used at the Guantanamo facility on terror suspects, although this hilariously backfired in one particular instance when a man named Shaka Amar, who was actually a fan of the music being played, most notably the song Here I Go Again by Whitesnake, and began singing along like an absolute boss, much to the frustration of his captors. Brilliant. And also, great song choice, bro. Personally, just play me a few seconds of Justin Bieber's Baby and I'm out. Fine, it was me that was stealing people's lunches from the break room fridge. Just please turn that shit off. Sensory deprivation. The polar opposite of overload, this method attempts to break the mind by denying it any form of visual or auditory stimulus. These are commonly known as a white room, and is not as fun as Cream made it sound in 1968. These special prison cells are literally painted white, as is everything inside. For added effect, it can be heavily soundproofed, meaning that sounds from outside are virtually eliminated. In the more extreme soundproof room, the effect can be so bad that all the person inside can hear is the blood flow in their ears. Sometimes, silence really can be deafening. The mind's constant search for stimuli can very quickly cause it to begin creating things, such as hallucinations, both visual and auditory, and a severe state of psychosis. It can be combined with other forms of torture, most notably starvation and stress positions, as we have already covered. The psychological effects of sensory deprivation can be permanent, leaving those subjected to it with long-lasting mental health issues. Pressing. Pressing is the act of placing a large flat board or door on top of a person's chest and large weights placed on top of that, with the weight being increased when the victim refuses to answer the questions put to them. Arguably, the most famous instance of pressing was that of Margaret Clitheroe in 1586. She was the wife of a butcher from the famous street in York known as the Shambles. Margaret was a recusant Catholic who ran the great risk of continuing to practice her faith at a time when persecution by Protestants was at a fever pitch. Margaret had been caught harbouring Catholic priests. As a punishment for this most heinous crime, she was taken to the old Ousegate Bridge, where she was to be pressed. A door was placed on top of her chest, and, with the public looking on, she was repeatedly asked to recant her faith. Each time, she refused. Slowly but surely, the weight was duly increased, and Margaret's chest was crushed. Rumour has it that she never uttered a single sound of pain from start to gruesome finish. She was only 29 years old. Naturally, for her bravery, Margaret Clitheroe is considered a Catholic martyr, and she was elevated to sainthood in 1970 by Pope Paul IV. She has also gained the nickname of the Pearl of York. A shrine to her has been set aside in the Shambles, but sadly not in the same building in where she lived. Her mummified right hand is preserved at the Bar Convent on Blossom Street just outside of Micklegate, and can be viewed by very special request. Flogging. Flogging or whipping has been a very common punishment throughout the history of nearly every society that has ever been, being mentioned in the Bible, and I'm sure other holy texts mention it too. The whip in question has garnered the fearsome nickname the Cat o' Nine Tails, and boy, this cat has some serious claws. The victim is usually tied to a vertical post such as a tree or a specially constructed tripod that will keep them upright when they inevitably slump down from the pain. There will be many minds that instantly imagine the awful treatment of slaves in the Deep South, but this is far from the only place where this occurred. Whips have been depicted in various early art forms and described in many ancient texts. Depending on both the strength of the person doing the whipping and how many lashes are to be given, the resultant injuries can range from just a few sore red marks to a bloodied mess of flesh that has been torn to ribbons, exposing muscle and bone. The use of flogging was widely used as a catch-all punishment in the armed forces of many nations. It finally came to an end in the British forces after the Cardwell reforms of 1870, and I'm certain that no soldier missed it. Keel hauling. Now, I did toy with the idea of reading this whole section in a pirate voice, but in the end, I couldn't be arsed. I will stop, but I will not apologise. Keel hauling is the most feared punishment in the Age of Sail. It could play a dual role of both punishment and execution depending on how long they remained dunked in the drink for. Essentially, keel hauling involves tying a loop of rope around the condemned, pushing them overboard, and then using the other end of the rope to drag them along the hull of the ship. The hull of the average sailing ship, after it had been at sea for a long time, would have accumulated a large number of barnacles and other similar creatures. It is surmised, therefore, that the punishment was made worse by being scraped along these hard and sharp-edged creatures' shells. This, on top of the fear of drowning, if you weren't so good at holding your breath. Yeesh. Whilst the actual proof for keel hauling ever actually happening is somewhat limited, there does seem to be enough anecdotal evidence that it certainly seems like it was a legitimate thing. Electro-Shock. Aficionados of the Rambo films and the first episode of Archer will know this one well. Essentially, two wires are connected to a power source, either mains electric or from a large battery like that from a go-kart. Golf cart. Sorry, Crenshaw. Golf cart. The wires can then be applied to the victim's body, the flow of current producing similar effects to that of a taser, intense pain, involuntary convulsions, burns, and a temporary loss of motor skills. Another, much more mobile variation of administering electric shocks takes the form of the cattle prod. Its name, of course, alluding to its original use of chivying along stubborn cows, but of course we have all seen their use in movies as a means of rendering a belligerent person unable to resist. And then there is the previously mentioned taser, the ranged weaponized version of a cattle prod, which has allowed many dangerous situations from escalating to the need to use deadly force. My best friend has been tasered before, silly boy, and he told me that it really wasn't a pleasant experience. Go figure. The pillory, or stocks. One of the more recognisable punishments from the days of yore, the pillory, more commonly known as the stocks, were a form of public humiliation. Usually the prescribed penalty for petty offences, the offending person would either have their head and hands or their feet secured between two planks with a small hole just big enough to allow the wrist, neck or ankle to sit in, but not big enough for them to be withdrawn. The planks would then be secured together by a hasp and lock for a set period. Then, as we all know, the poor sod would be left out in all weathers and subjected to the ire of the public. The classic being getting pelted with rotten food and lumps of shite, but they could also be outright physically assaulted, although usually a bailiff would be on hand to ensure that these things didn't get too bad. Once their sentence had passed, they would be released and left to their own devices. Presumably a change of clothing, a wash and a lie down would be in order. One could be placed in the stocks for a myriad of low-level transgressions, things that we would not even bat an eye at these days, such as swearing or drunkenness. It was a very popular punishment and became very widespread throughout the 16th and 18th centuries. It severely declined in the 19th century and was last thought to have been used in 1872 in Newcastle, northeast England. In the modern day, the pillory has become a twee little centrepiece of the average market town square, and a good way for parents to scare their children into behaving when they're out and about. The Scold's Bridle. Another piece of medieval skullduggery that was specially designed for the ladies because #equality? Anyway, the Scold's Bridle was used for the punishment of wives who had the audacity to nag their husbands. Now, gentlemen, let's keep this civil. The bridle was an iron cage that locked around the head with a padlock at the nape of the neck, with an extra spiked protrusion that went into the mouth, holding down the tongue and making it difficult and painful to speak. Sometimes an extra lanyard loop was incorporated into the cage to thread the rope through, and the poor lass could be paraded through the town by her husband to shame her in front of the entire local populace. Sometimes with the addition of a sign hung about the neck, reading Scold. Sometimes this humiliating punishment would be used if the lady in question was a gossip, or even if they were drunk. Who'd be a woman, eh? The bridle was known to be used right into the 1800s, with one recorded example of its use as late as 1856. It was finally erased from the statute book in the UK in 1967. Progress! Waterboarding. Widely considered the most deeply feared form of torture, waterboarding occupies an intersection between both physical and psychological torture. This torture involves the person having their limbs held down to limit resistance. A large, dense cloth, such as a face flannel or towel, is draped over the face, and a large quantity of water poured directly over the cloth. This floods the nostrils and mouth with water, inducing a severe gag reflex and an intense feeling of drowning. The worst part of this is that the ordeal will be interrupted and the face cloth removed for a very short time to allow the victim to catch their breath, only for the torturers to begin the process all over again. During these brief interruptions, an interrogator may give the victim an opportunity to answer questions or to give up the information required. The intense feelings of impending death and panic over the lack of oxygen can cause the victims to void their bladder and bowels. The prolonged lack of oxygen can also cause brain damage, and bones can easily be broken from any attempt at struggling. A variation of this method of torture from the medieval age is to cram a large amount of cloth into the victim's mouth and down the throat, followed by water, and then the cloth would be violently pulled out of their throat, causing extreme pain and gagging. This and the previously described method were enthusiastically employed by the infamous Spanish Inquisition. Another variation, known as Chinese water torture or the dripping machine, employs a long, drawn-out psychological torment. Essentially, the victim is tied down with their head pinioned in place, and a slow, cold drip of water is allowed to drop onto either the forehead or the scalp. This form of torture is very much reliant on patience, taking days or even weeks. The cold shock of the water keeps the victim awake, hastening the onset of sleep deprivation-related issues such as psychosis and hallucinations. And when the frequency of water drips is randomized, the effect is greatly enhanced and quickened. Amazingly, there is even a photograph existing of someone being subjected to this in Sing Sing prison in the USA. Bonus. And because many of you mentioned it, I feel I should address an oversight from my previous video on the execution methods of history, the companion piece to this one. Many of the commenters said that I forgot to include the horrific sentence of impaling. Truth be told, I did in fact remember it, and had written and recorded the whole section after I had begun editing what I had first written. The problem was that I completely forgot to add the impaling section into the bloody video. What a plank. So, to make amends, here is that missing section as a bonus. Enjoy. Impaling became the calling card of King Vlad III of Wallachia in Romania, who ruled in 3 stints between 1448 and 1477. He was so enamoured with impaling as his go-to punishment that he acquired the name Vlad Tepes, the Impaler. The condemned would be held on the ground with their legs forcibly splayed apart. A long and substantially girthy wooden stake would be liberally greased with tallow, and the pointy end shoved right up the old chocolate starfish. This resultant human lollipop would then be stood up vertically and secured into the ground. Over time, the person's own body weight would impale them further and further down the stake, displacing and rupturing internal organs, and eventually the spiked end would protrude through the chest or neck, turning our lollipop into a kebab. Mercifully, by that point the victim would most likely be dead, but then again, it's not exactly guaranteed. The human body can survive some very horrific trauma. I've seen enough videos of people who have been involved in car crashes to know that. Anyway, Vlad Tepes made sure his name was burned into the history books and would become part of the inspiration for possibly the most iconic baddie of all time, Dracula, originally written and published by Bram Stoker in 1897, only for that legacy then to be ruined in the modern day by turning vampires into sensitive, sparkly little pansies, but that's a whole other conversation. Legacy. The one thing that humanity has always been good at is coming up with novel, new ways to kill or hurt our fellow man. It is the one area where our creativity really knows no bounds. Even in the modern day, torture methods are still being employed. We all remember the previously mentioned scandal at Guantanamo Bay. And of course, there are still plenty that advocate its use, especially when it comes to the illusion of safety. I fear that it is an evil that will never be fully eradicated. Although huge advances have been made by groups such as Amnesty International, as well as the more extreme forms of torture euphemistically dubbed enhanced interrogation that were banned in the US in 2009 by President Barack Obama with the signing of Executive Order 13491. That being said, we can never truly know what goes on behind the closed doors of governments, and it is in their best interests to never reveal said secrets. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please click the like button and ding the bell to be notified of my future uploads. Hit the share button and send it to your like-minded friends, and follow us on Facebook for regular updates as well. Are there any other torture methods you know of that I missed out? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to be able to gather enough material for a part 2 episode. You all know I do love reading and replying to your comments. In other news, my very good friend Steve and his lovely wife Jen were kind enough to surprise me with this beautiful black slate coaster for my computer desk. So, to repay their kindness, I hope you don't mind if I give their little family business a bit of a shout out. Full disclosure, they're not paying me for this aside from the coasters, which were not solicited but gifted. Anyhow, here is the description of what they offer. The Black Bee is a luxurious, high-quality brand offering a selection of custom art and giftware. They currently specialize in, but are not limited to, bespoke, handmade candles and accessories such as long-lasting scented, vibrant colored wax melts, custom art prints, down to slate and wooden coasters, signs, and plaques, all of which are handmade. They have a range of differing designs, as well as offering a bespoke design and printing service. If you wish to view any of their products, they are currently residing on Etsy and also have a presence on eBay, both under the name The Black Bee UK. You can also follow them on Facebook or Instagram. I shall throw all their socials up on the screen for you now. So thank you once again to Steve and Jen for your lovely gift. It now takes pride of place beside my computer whilst I record this. I wish you all prosperity with your business. Seriously, guys and gals, please check them out. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link below, or if you prefer to go down the one-off donation route, you can hit the Super Thanks button. There is always the DID store on Teespring if you are looking for something practical, and you can go and purchase the merch. A huge thank you to everyone that has contributed thus far. You are all leg ends, and I love you. And if you can't get enough of the notorious DID, head on over to my alternate channel, DID Reads, where I post renditions of poetry, famous speeches, etc. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.